Hey guys, welcome back to Tenta Outdoors. My name's Al Tenta. Thanks for checking in again this week. I really appreciate it. This week, I'm actually in Calgary visiting family, so I'm doing the recap like underneath their sun deck while everybody's upstairs. So not ideal. I would rather be doing the recap in one of my hunting spots back home, but we got to make this work. So stick around for Alone Season 10, Episode 7 recap. So first up on the episode was me. And they start out by me kind of looking closer in the camera, and I'm seeing changes in my face. I'm seeing these lines that never used to be there, and I can really tell my face is starting to lose weight. And I called myself, if I remember correctly, a skinny, gray, old man, and I need to get some fat back on my face. I need to catch some fish. The next scene, they show me checking my gill net. And as I cruise down and check my gill net, there is a duck called a merganser entangled in my net. And I remember this moment well. What they didn't show on the episode was I was just simply washing my hands one night or something, and I noticed there was a large bald eagle perched on the shore staring in a direction. And I'm going, what's that bald eagle looking at? He's staring at my duck. And that's when I noticed my duck. So I got to give thanks to that bald eagle that kind of brought my attention to that my merganser was caught in my gill net, because if I hadn't noticed him, that bald eagle was obviously going to help himself to a free meal. So I had to go down and I had to release the duck from that net. Even though I would have loved to have that greasy pile of duck meat, the hunting regulations state that you are not able to catch waterfowl in a net. So technically I had caught it in the net, and if I did kill that duck, not only would that be poaching, but it would also be cheating in the game. There's been some comments online like, what's Alan doing? Why didn't he just turn off his camera? And I could have easily turned off that camera. I could have gone down and killed the duck and eaten it without anybody ever knowing. But you know who would have known? Me. I would have known. And if I did continue far in the game, and if I did do well, then that would always kind of weigh on my mind, and that would be cheating. So I did what I thought was right. I mean, if it had been a true survival situation where if I was, if I was lost in the bush or whatever, then of course the regulations would have not mattered, because it was a true survival situation. But is this a true survival situation when you can press a button and tap out whenever you want? That's a question I guess you kind of have to ask yourself. There were some other comments I read online about, well, okay, fair enough that you're following the regulations, but once you release it from the net, then it's fair game, correct? And technically, yes. But if you notice the duck, once I cut that final strand off his back and he became free, he simply ran and he dove into the water, and I never saw him again. Those animals can hold their breath for a very long time, and he swam underwater far into the depths of the lake, and I never saw him again. So after I released the duck from the gill net, the next scene showed me I have my gill net strung out between two trees, and it had a massive hole in it from where I had to cut all the way around that duck to free him from my net. And I did kind of a bad David Attenborough imitation while I was patching it, just kind of being silly. And I think I was goofy and silly out there fairly often, just to kind of help pass the time and keep a positive mindset. So I ended up patching the net without a problem and resetting it in a spot, and I was pretty happy with the set. If you noticed, when I set it this time after I mended it, I set it quite a bit deeper. It was hanging off the log a few feet further, and it was just off the bottom, and I was really happy with that set. I also made a comment about how life is so simple when you're out here. You simply have to worry about staying warm, getting enough food, and keeping the dark thoughts out of your mind. And I mentioned that morning, it was the first morning that dark thoughts had actually started to creep into my mind. And I started thinking more about my dad and my father's death and the whole experience around that. It was very windy at my area, and when it's windy, it's really hard to cast my hand line, and fishing is basically impossible. But there was a bay, must have been a kilometer away, something like that. It was hard to get there because there was no trail, and the bush was really, really thick. But there was a nice sheltered bay that I wanted to check out. So I packed up my fishing gear, packed up my camera gear, threw a jacket in my bag, and I headed down the beach to check out this new area. They showed me kind of trucking through the trees, and it really shows how thick the bush was in my area. Eventually I made it there, but along the way I found an opening where I did discover some fresh moose tracks. It was kind of exciting because it kind of gave me hope that, hey, big game in the area is probably maybe 2 weeks old, but it had passed through there while I was there. And it just gave me hope that I still potentially have a chance at getting a big game animal. So when I was at that sheltered bay fishing, they had a voiceover while I was fishing of me thinking about how other competitors were doing in the game. I was wondering if somebody had got a moose and they were sitting on 3/4 of a moose. I was wondering if someone had got a bear. How many fish had they caught? How many people are left in the game? So these thoughts, these are just some of the thoughts that are going through your brain on a daily basis. I also made a comment, we are about to enter into the dark days of this competition. And what do I mean by that? Well, dark days, yes, the days are getting shorter, but what I mean by the dark days are food is going to become more and more scarce. Fish will move out into the deeper water. Foraging will become more and more difficult. The plants are dying off. The berries are rotten. The mushrooms are rotten. And with all that less daylight that there is, you're spending more time in your shelter, more time in the darkness, more time alone with your thoughts. And our physical and mental condition are also declining. So I arrived at that sheltered bay and I began fishing immediately. I was actually really pleasantly surprised how good it looked there. I was hopeful with the fishing opportunities because the water seemed very deep. What I didn't like about that place is what they don't show this on the episode, but it was hard standing. It was kind of a steep drop off and there wasn't a good place to pull up a fish. That's the area where a net would have been helpful because I didn't have that sloped rock to pull my fish up onto shore. But I got a bite fairly quickly. It was more of a strike. And then a few minutes later, I actually hooked up a fish and got him to the rocks. And just as I was about to pull him up, he got off. I got a little frustrated, but I kept my composure and said, getting angry like this doesn't do anything for me. It just kind of makes me look like a fool, and I'm going to stay calm and positive. So even though I didn't catch any fish in that sheltered bay excursion I went on, I did kind of take it as a positive because what it told me was the fish haven't moved out in the deeper water yet and the fish are still biting, and I was confident that I could continue to catch fish in the upcoming weeks. I discussed how on my way back, hopefully I could have a chance encounter with that moose. And then they did another voiceover about my dad and how since my dad's passing, I learned not to get caught up about the small things in life and only worry about the things in life that really matter, like family. So the way the last episode and episode 7 kind of portrayed me was I was losing quite a few fish. I was losing more fish than I was catching. So I kind of studied my lure and I looked at the fish's mouths and I noticed that the lake trout's mouth isn't overly huge and my lure might have been a bit too big. So what I did, I made a few modifications to it. I actually made it shorter and I attached smaller hooks to the lure. And believe it or not, it worked right away. My first bite after I modified the lure, I got a hook up and the fish stayed on and was able to land it successfully. So what the edit was really trying to do in my scenes during this episode was kind of full circle with the message from my dad, which is still hard for me to say, which is look at it, study it, and figure it out. And that's kind of what I did. That's what I did with the lure. I made some changes, I studied it, and I figured it out, and eventually became successful with that lure. So yeah, I really liked the way they portrayed my dad in that episode, and yeah, it was a special episode for my family and I because it included a lot. It included a lot of my dad's lessons that he taught my brothers and I. So my last scene showed me fishing in an extremely calm lake. I made a comment that this lake is like a duck pond. And I was fishing and thinking and just, having a good old time on my rock on that beautiful day. And I caught that one fish, landed successfully, and of course, if they're biting, I'm going to keep on fishing. And I had an experience with a very large pike. And I remember this very, very clearly because it was super exciting. So as I was, I cast and I retrieve. As I was retrieving, I noticed something in the water following after my lure. right before that, there had just been a little bump. Like I could just feel it in my hand. That's the nice thing about hand lining. You can feel every little bump and tickle on that line. So after that little bump, I go, oh, I think it was a bite. I wasn't sure if it was the bottom. And then I just kept on reeling, kept on retrieving, and I saw what looked like a giant log coming through the water after my lure, very, very slowly, just effortlessly floating behind my lure. Unfortunately, I had nowhere left to go. Like I'd reeled in, I was like a foot away from the rock, but he was still moving towards my lure. So my lure actually came to rest on the rock. The pike went right up to it, and he went, and he literally inhaled my lure right down into his gullet. And I set my hook very firmly, and as I set my hook, his teeth cut my line. Now you may be asking, why didn't you have a steel leader? I did have a steel leader. My steel leader I had on top of that lure was probably about that long, but he took it so deeply in his throat that my steel leader wasn't long enough, and I ended up cutting my monofilament line on one of his teeth. Oh, I mean, that would have been a pike. It was a Wyatt size or bigger pike for sure. And again, it would have been days worth of food. It would have been awesome. So I'm surprised I didn't get more upset. I think I was probably in a pretty good mood because I had just landed a fish, and I'd had a couple moments where I'd become quite angry fishing. So I was really trying to control my mind and stay positive, even if I had some bad luck fishing. So, and it was just a really cool experience. So I didn't get that upset about it because this massive pike was right there. And he just turned around and swam slowly away with my lake trout baby 2 in his mouth. Then I went and got my first lure, my lake trout baby 1, and I continued fishing with that, but I didn't get any more strikes that evening. And I just said, well, I really want to stay in this competition for as long as I can, and I'm just going to keep on grinding. So Mel's part in this episode began with her coming out of her shelter and noticing a large tree had fallen very close to her. So she had been stuck inside her shelter for like 3 days, and she was elated to be back outside again. Melanie decided to go for a trek back to her blueberry patch. Along the way, she did notice that there was ice on the shores, which is a real sign of what's coming. About a fifth of the way there, she started feeling lightheaded, exhausted, and just sick, and she was forced to turn around and head back to her shelter. She just didn't have the energy to continue. Mel made a comment about how she turned off her camera because she felt very foolish, and she admitted that it's taken her some time to feel comfortable sharing her true emotions and feelings to the camera. So when Melanie got back to her shelter, she made a new plan. Her new plan was to eat more restored food, rest a few days, regain her strength, and return again to the berry patch when she felt better. So I want to do a shout out to something that the edit didn't really go into a lot of detail about regarding Mel. So a few times they've showed Mel's shelter, and my eye immediately goes to her fireplace and her chimney. And I'm looking at that, I'm looking how sweet that is, and I just wanted to know more about it. And it looked like she sealed it with clay or mud, but it looked very well done, and I was super impressed with her fireplace and chimney that she had integrated inside her shelter. So Melanie talked about how her blueberries, her stores of blueberries in her shelter, were like a refresher for her clothing, gave it that nice scent. And that's a good thing, and I could have used some of those too because I don't think I smelled very fresh when I was out there. So after Melanie's rest and her consumption of her additional food, she had enough strength and endurance to make it to the berry patch and was able to replenish her supplies of berries, and I'm sure she filled her belly while she was out there too. So she was very pleased and happy with her ability to recover and make that plan, and her plan be successful and work out. Nicely done, Mel. So next up in this episode, we have Wyatt. They show Wyatt repairing his gill net from its experience in the storm and setting it in the same spot that he caught that massive pike in the previous episode. So Wyatt's fishing has been shut down for 3 days because of the storm, and he's super excited to get back into his main game, which is fishing. I really like how Wyatt personifies Reindeer Lake, and he asks if it will provide for him. So Wyatt makes a comment about how being honest and vulnerable is a staple of the show, and I agree with him. So Wyatt lets the audience in on a little secret. Apparently he injured himself on a piece of wood and he embedded some wood into his forearm, and it's become pretty badly infected. I mean, when he lifted up his arm and he started squeezing, and that watery kind of pus started to come out, it was pretty gross. But Wyatt is treating it with natural materials out there on his site, and he says it's definitely getting better. So Wyatt was kind of keeping this a secret from production because he didn't want to risk being removed from the show and taken to the hospital because of that injury. Because if you have to be removed for any reason and get it checked out of the hospital, you're out of the game. And he was not going to let that happen. So Wyatt, keeping his injury from production, really showed his determination, and that he wants to be here on the show for a lot longer. So the next scene is a very interesting one. It shows Wyatt just kind of standing in front of the lake in the morning and saying, you know what? Something just feels different. I don't know what it is. It's not good. It's not bad. It just feels different. Then he went on to say that he's feeling a lot less negative thoughts in his mind. He's not sure where they're going, but they're definitely going. Now, this next piece that Wyatt talks about it was very interesting to me because I'd never really thought about it this way before. He said, we're not in competition with each other, because even if you removed all the other participants, nothing would really change. He says, we're in competition with ourselves and with Mother Nature. So the next scene shows Wyatt fishing with his rod. And he's fishing with a new lure called the Reindeer Demon. And sure enough, he catches a slab of a lake trout. He says it's the biggest lake trout that he's caught by hand on his fishing rod, and he estimates its weight at about 7 pounds. A short time later, he actually loses that lure that he had created. When he was casting, the lure just kind of broke off and he lost it to the lake. He got pretty upset, but he kept his composure, tried to keep it positive. And one of the things he said was ups and downs. Man, so many bleeps, ups and downs. So after his mishap with the lure, he says, you know what? I'm not going to freak out about this. I'm simply going to grab my bow. I'm going to go for a walk, do a little hunting, and check my gill net. Sure enough, as he's starting his walk to his gill net, he sees a grouse, makes a successful shot, harvests the grouse. He's continuing on towards his net. He sees a red squirrel, he makes a good shot, and harvests that nice red squirrel. Then he gets to his gill net. Believe it or not, as he checks his gill net, there's a large whitefish in his gill net, so he just procured an incredible amount of food. This is a really good day for Wyatt. He's got the biggest lake trout he's ever caught, a grouse, a squirrel, and a large whitefish in his gill net. Wyatt is kicking some serious butt. So his earlier statements that he made that morning about something feels different about this day were completely proven correct. During this episode, you can really see Wyatt solidify his relationship with the land. Next up on episode 7 was Taz. Taz started out the episode by noticing that it's getting much colder and he needed to make a door for a shelter to protect him from the cold. It's also his mom's 51st birthday, and he talks about how important she is to him and how strong of a woman she is. So Taz discusses how he used his creative talents that he inherited from his mother to push him forward in life. So he wants to celebrate his mother's birthday by eating an entire grouse. So he hikes up to his food cache, and we all know what happened next. All his food was infested by maggots. Not just 1 or 2 maggots, but like lots of maggots. It was actually really gross. If you're eating dinner during this episode, you might have wanted to pause it or push your plate aside for a few minutes and maybe try eating again later. So Taz is obviously very upset. It's all the food he has left in storage, and it's just writhing, seething with maggots. And he makes a comment, he goes, oh, I'm this close to tapping out. But he didn't. He totally recovered, cleaned off the meat, brushed out as many maggots as he could. I assume he probably cut out any parts that were badly damaged or rotten. And he goes, I'm just going to boil the heck out of this to kill any sort of bacteria or rot, and I'm going to eat it. And eat it he did. So at the risk of becoming ill, he boiled it up and he ate it. And so far in the episode, he didn't have any ill effects from it. So this act of eating that spoiled meat and just really speaks about Taz's determination to continue on in the game and his ability to conquer adversity. They also show Taz completing a chair project. So to ensure that Taz's fish was very dry to help reduce the chance of maggots returning or any sort of spoilage, he had them drying outside a shelter and he left them up there overnight. Unfortunately, in the morning, his fish were on the ground and half of one of the fish had been eaten by what he thinks is a marten. So really unfortunate. He took it pretty well though. He stayed positive, and he alluded to, man, everything out here is after my food. Maggots, martens, birds, you name it, everything out there wants to eat his fish. So the next scene shows Taz heading down to check his gill net. Now the anchor line that Taz had attached to his log, that his gill net was hung off of, had broken during that vicious storm and it actually floated away. Luckily he was able to recover it a short way down the beach. It was tangled around the log, but it didn't look too badly damaged, and I'm sure he'll be able to untangle it, fix it, and set it up again later. So Taz decides to change his strategy. He's going to move from a fishing mentality to a trapping mentality, and he makes what's called a squirrel pole. So next up on the episode, we have Mikey, and they show Mikey carving what's called a little fidget toy, which was a type of top, for his son, Nikolai, and I gotta say he did an excellent job on that. He tried it out and it worked perfectly. So Mike went on to talk about how he has some grouse meat dried and stored for future use, and that he's feeling really strong in the game right now. So as Mikey heads out hunting, he talks about how he's completely adapted to the land and how much he's learned since day one when he was dropped off here. He knows every trail. He knows where the squirrels are hanging out. He knows where to hunt grouse. He feels really connected to his land and is adapted completely to his spot. So Mikey said something during that episode that really resonated with me. He said, "There's a comfort sitting in the woods," and I could not agree with him more. I love sitting in my tree stand for hours on end, just unwinding, letting myself relax and observing what's going on around me. Nothing could be more relaxing and comfortable and therapeutic for my mind. So just to expand on that a little bit further, there's people that need to charge their batteries being around large groups of people, doing activities with large groups of people. But then there's people that recharge their batteries in solitude, surrounded by nature. And I'm definitely one of those people, and I'm pretty sure Mikey is too. So during his hunt, Mike is able to harvest a squirrel. He makes a great shot and makes a quick, clean kill on the squirrel. And they show him eating it, cleaning it, and he definitely utilizes every single piece of that squirrel, including the brain and including the tongue. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. My name is Al Tenta. This is Tenta Outdoors. If you do enjoy this content, please consider subscribing to my channel. And don't forget to tune in to Alone, Season 10, Episode 8, next week on the History Channel. Until then, we'll see you next time.